March 18th, 1959. 6:37 in the morning. A sanitation worker named Marcus Webb was walking along the Hudson River waterfront when he saw something that would make him stop eating breakfast for a week. A body. Face down. Arms spread wide like a man trying to embrace the dirty water that had become his grave. The police pulled Detective Ray Sullivan out of the Hudson at 7:15. His service weapon was still holstered. His badge was still pinned to his chest, and in the inside pocket of his coat, wrapped in plastic to protect it from the water, was exactly $25,000 in cash. Blood money that he never got the chance to spend. The newspapers would call it a mob hit. The police would call it an occupational hazard. But nobody would tell you the real story. Nobody would explain how a 15-year veteran of the NYPD, a man with a spotless record and 3 kids at home, ended up floating in the river with a fortune in his pocket and 3 bullets in the back of his head. To understand that, you need to go back 96 hours. You need to go back to the moment when Ray Sullivan stopped being a good cop and became a desperate man. 96 hours earlier. St. Luke's Hospital, intensive care unit. Ray Sullivan sat in a plastic chair that was too small for his frame, holding his daughter's hand while his wife lay dying 6 feet away. The machines beeped in rhythm with Helen's failing heart. The morphine drip kept her comfortable, but everyone in that room knew comfortable wasn't the same as better. 8-year-old Katie Sullivan looked up at her father with eyes that were too young to understand death but old enough to recognize fear. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small and fragile in the sterile hospital air. "Is Mommy going to die?" The question hit Sullivan like a punch to the gut, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he did. The doctors had been clear. Stage 4 cancer, spread to the liver, the lungs, the bones. Without the experimental treatment at Johns Hopkins, Helen had maybe 3 months. With the treatment, maybe a year. Maybe 2 if they were lucky. The treatment cost $47,000. Insurance covered $11,000. That left $36,000 that Ray Sullivan didn't have. Couldn't have. Not on a detective's salary. Not with 3 kids and a mortgage and a car that was held together with duct tape and prayers. Sullivan looked at his daughter, at those innocent eyes waiting for an answer. And he did what every parent does when the truth is too terrible to speak. He lied. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice cracking. "Mommy's going to be fine. The doctors are taking good care of her." Katie nodded, wanting to believe, needing to believe. She squeezed her father's hand and went back to coloring in the book that the nurses had given her. Sullivan watched her draw flowers and sunshine, creating beauty in a room that smelled like death and disinfectant. And something inside him broke, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet crack, like ice splitting on a frozen lake, the kind of crack that spreads slowly until the whole surface gives way. That night, Sullivan went home to an empty house. His 2 boys were staying with his sister in Queens. Katie was asleep on a cot in Helen's hospital room. He sat at the kitchen table surrounded by medical bills, and he did the math for the 100th time. $47,000, minus the $11,000 insurance would cover, equals $36,000 he needed to save his wife's life. His annual salary as a detective was $22,000. After taxes, mortgage, food, utilities, and everything else, he saved maybe $200 a month. At that rate, it would take him 15 years to save enough money. Helen didn't have 15 years. She didn't have 15 months. She barely had 15 weeks. Sullivan stared at those numbers until they blurred together, until the kitchen light hurt his eyes, until the clock on the wall showed 3 in the morning and he still hadn't moved. That's when the phone rang. Nobody calls with good news at 3 in the morning. Sullivan picked up the receiver, expecting the hospital, expecting bad news about Helen. Instead, he heard a voice he didn't recognize. Smooth, calm, professional. "Detective Sullivan," the voice said. "We need to talk about your wife." What Sullivan didn't know, couldn't have known, was that while he was sitting in that kitchen drowning in despair, someone else was wide awake on the other side of town. Someone who never seemed to need sleep. Someone who was always 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the game. The same night, Sullivan got that phone call. Bumpy Johnson was standing on the corner of 145th Street and Lenox Avenue, watching Harlem wake up. It was 5:30 in the morning. The street cleaners were making their rounds. The early shift workers were heading to the subway. The numbers runners were collecting the previous night's bets. And Bumpy Johnson saw all of it, controlled all of it, protected all of it. Not because he was the biggest or the strongest or the most violent, but because he was the smartest, because he understood something that most people never learned. Real power doesn't come from fear. It comes from being indispensable. At 6:15, Bumpy was having breakfast at Louise's diner when he noticed 3 men in dark suits walking toward Giuseppe's grocery on the corner. He recognized them immediately. Soldiers from the Genovese family, here to collect protection money. Giuseppe was 72 years old and barely made enough to keep the lights on. He couldn't afford to pay the Italians, but refusing them meant a broken window tonight, a fire next week. Or worse. Bumpy put down his coffee, walked outside, and positioned himself between the 3 soldiers and Giuseppe's front door. The lead soldier, a thick-necked enforcer named Paulie Greco, stopped short. He knew who Bumpy Johnson was. Everyone knew. "This doesn't concern you." "Bumpy," Paulie said, trying to sound tough but not quite managing it. "Giuseppe is late on his payments. We're just here to have a conversation." Bumpy didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't even change his expression. He just looked at Paulie with those calm, calculating eyes that had made stronger men reconsider their life choices. "Giuseppe pays me," Bumpy said quietly. "I pay you. That's how it works north of 110th Street. Or did somebody forget to tell you the rules?" Paulie's hand moved toward his jacket. One of the other soldiers took a step forward. The third one looked nervous, glancing up and down the street to see who was watching. And that's when Bumpy did something that would seem crazy to anyone who didn't understand the game. He smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a threatening smile. Just a knowing smile that said he could see exactly how this was going to play out, and Paulie wasn't going to like it. "You can pull that gun," Bumpy said, still smiling. "You can probably even shoot me before I move. But then what you think you're walking out of Harlem? You think your bosses are going to protect you after you start a war they can't win." The street had gone quiet. The early morning workers had stopped walking. The street cleaners had stopped cleaning. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting to see if these Italian soldiers were stupid enough to pull a weapon on Bumpy Johnson in the middle of his kingdom. Paulie looked around, saw the odds, and made the smart choice. He lowered his hand, stepped back, nodded slowly. "We'll tell Mr. Genovese you're handling Giuseppe's account," he said, trying to save face. "I'm sure he'll want to discuss the arrangement." Bumpy's smile widened. "You do that. And Paulie, next time you come to Harlem, call first. It's just good manners." The 3 soldiers left. Giuseppe came out of his store, tears in his eyes, trying to thank Bumpy. Bumpy waved him off, told him to keep his money this month, get his daughter's birthday present, worry about next month when next month came. Then he walked back to his breakfast like nothing had happened. That was the difference between Bumpy Johnson and everyone else. Everyone else used power to take. Bumpy used power to protect, and that made him untouchable in ways that guns and money never could. But while Bumpy was protecting his kingdom, forces were moving against him that even he couldn't see yet. Forces that would test everything he'd built, everything he believed, everything he was. 2 nights later, Ray Sullivan found himself standing in Woodlawn Cemetery at 2 in the morning, waiting for a man he'd never met. The voice on the phone had been specific. Section 12. By the Morrison Family Mausoleum. Come alone. Don't tell anyone. And bring an open mind. Sullivan knew this was wrong. Knew every instinct he'd developed in 15 years of police work was screaming at him to walk away. But he also knew his wife was dying. Knew his daughter's question kept echoing in his mind. Knew that desperation makes people do things they'd never imagine in their rational moments. At 2:15, a black Cadillac pulled up to the cemetery gates. A man got out. Not big. Not obviously dangerous. Just a man in an expensive suit with a face that belonged in a corporate boardroom. Tony the Shark. Torino walked through the cemetery like he owned it, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path, his breath making small clouds in the cold March air. He stopped 10 feet from Sullivan and studied him like a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. "Detective Sullivan," Torino said, not a question. A statement. "Thank you for coming." Sullivan's hand instinctively moved toward his service weapon. Torino noticed and smiled. "You won't need that. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help you." He reached into his jacket. Sullivan tensed, but Torino just pulled out 2 envelopes. Plain manila envelopes that looked completely ordinary and completely terrifying at the same time. "I'm going to put these on the bench between us," Torino said calmly. "Then I'm going to step back. You can open them when you're ready." Sullivan stared at the envelopes. His mouth was dry. His heart was hammering against his ribs. Everything about this was wrong. Everything about this screamed trap. But Torino had mentioned his wife on the phone. Had mentioned the experimental treatment. Had mentioned that $47,000 was a lot of money for a cop to find. "What's in them?" Sullivan asked, hating how his voice shook. Torino tilted his head. "Information. Options. Opportunities. Open the one on the left first." Sullivan's hands trembled as he picked up the left envelope. Inside was cash, crisp $100 bills bound with paper bands. He didn't count them. Didn't need to. He'd been a cop long enough to know what $5,000 looked like. "That's a down payment," Torino said. "Proof of good faith. No strings attached. You can take it and walk away right now. Use it for your wife's treatment. I'll never contact you again." Sullivan looked up sharply. "And the other envelope?" Torino's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That one you don't need to open. That one is just insurance. Proof that I know who you are, where you work, where your kids go to school." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "But like I said, you don't need to open it. In fact, I recommend you don't. Some things are better left unknown." Sullivan felt sick. The $5,000 in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. This wasn't help. This was a hook. A trap. A choice that wasn't really a choice at all. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. Torino stepped closer. "Simple. There's a man in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson. You know him." Sullivan nodded. Every cop in Manhattan knew Bumpy Johnson. "Mr. Johnson has become problematic. For business. We need him off the streets for a while. Nothing permanent. Just long enough for the landscape to change." The words hung in the cold cemetery air like a death sentence. Torino was asking him to frame Bumpy Johnson, to plant evidence, to become exactly the kind of corrupt cop that Sullivan had spent 15 years refusing to be. "I can't," Sullivan whispered. Torino shrugged. "Of course you can. You're a decorated detective. Your word carries weight. 1 bag of heroin, 1 arrest, 1 conviction, and your wife gets her treatment. Your kids get their mother back. Your daughter stops asking if mommy's going to die. Sullivan's vision blurred, tears he didn't want Torino to see building in his eyes. And if I say no? Torino picked up the second envelope, didn't open it, just held it up so Sullivan could see it. Then you go home to your dying wife. You watch her fade. You explain to your children why you had the chance to save her and chose not to. And you live with that choice for the rest of your life. He put the envelope back on the bench. The money's yours regardless, like I said. Good faith. But the rest, that's up to you. You have 72 hours to decide. Torino walked back to his Cadillac, drove away, left Sullivan standing in a cemetery surrounded by the dead, holding $5,000, and wondering if there was any difference between killing a man with a gun and killing him with a frame job. He looked down at the money in his hand, thought about Helen, thought about Katie's question, thought about how far a good man could fall when the people he loved were dying and nobody else was offering to help. By the time Sullivan left that cemetery, the second envelope was still unopened on the bench, but the $5,000 was in his pocket, and the hook was set. While Sullivan was making the worst decision of his life, Bumpy Johnson was sitting in the back room of the Cotton Club, listening to a man beg for forgiveness. Jerome Washington had worked for Bumpy for 7 years. Doorman at the club, reliable, loyal, family man with 2 daughters and a wife who made the best sweet potato pie in Harlem. Jerome was also a gambling addict who owed money to people who didn't accept apologies as payment. He'd come to Bumpy tonight because those people had given him a choice. Help them set up Bumpy Johnson, or watch his family suffer. Jerome was on his knees, tears streaming down his face, words tumbling out so fast they ran together. Mr. Johnson, I swear, I never wanted this. They got to me through my debts, said they'd hurt my family, said they'd make my daughters pay. I told them no. I told them I'd rather die. But they said they'd kill them. Not me. Them. He looked up at Bumpy with desperate eyes. I came to you because I didn't know what else to do. Because you're the only one who's ever helped me without asking for something in return. Bumpy didn't speak. He just poured tea from a ceramic pot into 2 cups, handed one to Jerome, gestured for him to sit. Jerome took the cup with shaking hands, confused by the calm. Most bosses would have exploded by now, would have reached for a weapon, would have started planning how to dispose of a traitor. But Bumpy just sipped his tea and waited. After a long moment, he spoke. Jerome, how long have you worked for me? 7 years, Mr. Johnson. And in those 7 years, have I ever lied to you? No, sir. Have I ever hurt your family? No, sir. You saved my daughter when she needed medicine, forgave my debts when I couldn't pay. Bumpy nodded slowly. So when these people came to you, when they told you to betray me, what did you think I would do? Jerome swallowed hard. I thought you'd kill me. Bumpy smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not a mocking smile. Just a sad, knowing smile that said he'd seen this play out 100 times before. Jerome, I've known about this for 3 weeks. The cup slipped from Jerome's hand, shattered on the floor. Tea spread across the wood like blood. You knew. Bumpy set down his own cup. The Italian family trying to move into Harlem isn't subtle. They've been asking questions, making contacts, buying debts. I've been watching them the whole time, watching to see who they'd approach, who they'd try to flip, who they thought was weak enough to break. He leaned forward. They didn't choose you because you're weak, Jerome. They chose you because they know I trust you. They needed someone close to me, someone I wouldn't suspect. That's actually smart. Dangerous, but smart. Jerome was shaking. Mr. Johnson, I'm so sorry. I never meant. Bumpy held up a hand. I know, and that's why you're still breathing. That's why your family is safe. Because you came to me. Because even when they threatened everything you love, you chose loyalty over survival. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out at Harlem spreading beneath him like a kingdom. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to those Italians. You're going to tell them yes. You're going to do exactly what they ask. Jerome's face went white. Sir. Bumpy turned back, his expression unreadable. They want you to set up a meeting, to make sure I'm alone on a certain night, to help them get to me. So that's what you're going to do. He walked back to Jerome, put a hand on his shoulder. Jerome, they didn't choose you because you're weak. They chose you because they know I trust you, and that's the most dangerous weapon they could have used. But here's what they don't understand. Here's what separates predators from prey. He squeezed Jerome's shoulder. Sometimes the best trap is the one you walk into with your eyes open. Jerome didn't understand. Couldn't understand. How could walking into a trap be a strategy? How could letting your enemies get close be anything but suicide? But he'd learned over 7 years that Bumpy Johnson saw angles that other people missed, played games that operated on levels most people couldn't comprehend. What do you need me to do? Jerome asked quietly. Bumpy smiled. Exactly what they told you. No more, no less. And Jerome, when this is over, your debts are paid, your family is protected, and you're going to learn something about how the game is really played. That conversation happened on March 1st, 12 days before Detective Ray Sullivan would plant heroin in Bumpy Johnson's coat pocket. 12 days before the trap would spring. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't waiting for the trap. He was building one of his own. A trap so sophisticated, so perfectly constructed, that everyone who walked into it would think they were the hunters right up until the moment they realized they were the prey. March 3rd. The basement of Mother A.M.E. Zion Church on 137th Street. Bumpy had called a meeting, but not with his usual crew. Not with the soldiers and enforcers and muscle who handled the day-to-day operations of his empire. This meeting was different. This meeting was about chess, not checkers. 6 people sat around a table in the church basement. 3 of them were criminals. 3 of them were cops. And all of them were about to become part of something that would change Harlem forever. Illinois Gordon, Bumpy's second in command, looked around the table suspiciously. He'd been with Bumpy for 12 years, had seen him orchestrate operations that seemed impossible. But sitting down with cops, that was new territory. Dangerous territory. Sergeant Marcus Williams, a black officer who'd grown up 3 blocks from where they were sitting, met Illinois' stare calmly. He'd been feeding Bumpy information for years, not because he was corrupt, but because he'd watched corrupt cops destroy his community while pretending to protect it. Detective Frank McCarthy, Irish, 3rd generation NYPD, had his own reasons for being here. Bumpy's money had kept his father's store from being robbed into bankruptcy, had kept his neighborhood from becoming a war zone. Lieutenant David Cohen, Jewish, 22 years on the force, nodded to Bumpy respectfully. They'd had an understanding for years, an unspoken agreement that some criminals were better for the community than some cops. Bumpy stood at the head of the table. Gentlemen, we have a problem, but more importantly, we have an opportunity. He laid out everything, the Italian family's plan, Jerome's recruitment, the frame job they were preparing, the dirty cop they'd bought, the corruption network that made it all possible. Illinois Gordon was the first to speak, his voice tight with anger. So we take out the cop. We take out the Italians. We send a message that nobody frames Bumpy Johnson and lives to talk about it. Bumpy shook his head. That's the obvious play. That's what they expect. That's why it won't work. He pulled out a map of police corruption networks, financial records, photographs of meetings between cops and mobsters. This isn't about one dirty cop. This is about a system, a network that's been operating for decades. Taking down one cop, they'll just replace him. We need to take down the whole structure. Detective McCarthy leaned forward. How? Bumpy smiled. That calm, knowing smile that meant he'd been planning this for longer than anyone realized. By letting them frame me. The room exploded. Illinois jumped to his feet. You're insane. You're talking about putting yourself in a cage, trusting that these cops and prosecutors will help you later. What if it doesn't work? What if the corruption goes deeper than we think? What if I'm smarter than they are? Bumpy interrupted quietly. The room went silent. Illinois. For 15 years, I've been fighting crime families who think they can take Harlem because they own cops and judges. Every time we beat them, they come back with more corruption, more bent law enforcement, more officials on their payroll. He spread his hands over the documents on the table. This is our chance to cut the cancer out at the source, to expose a corruption network so thoroughly that they can't just cover it up and rebuild. Lieutenant Cohen spoke up, his voice measured. What exactly are you proposing? Bumpy laid out the plan. It was audacious, dangerous, brilliant. He would let the frame job proceed exactly as planned. Let the dirty cop plant evidence. Let the arrest happen. Let himself be taken into custody. But while the conspirators thought they were winning, Bumpy's people would be documenting everything, every procedural violation, every corrupt contact, every illegal payment, every lie, building a case so airtight that even the most corrupt DA couldn't ignore it. Marcus, Bumpy said, turning to Sergeant Williams, I need you close when this goes down, not involved in the arrest. Can't compromise your position, but close enough to witness, to photograph, to document chain of custody violations. Williams nodded slowly. What about after, when you're in custody? Bumpy looked at Detective McCarthy. Frank, you track the evidence. Where it goes, who handles it, any irregularities in processing. McCarthy was already taking notes. David, Bumpy continued, addressing Lieutenant Cohen. You're the paperwork specialist. I need to know when reports get filed, who signs off, what unusual approvals happen, where the corruption shows itself in the official record. Cohen's expression was grim. This is dangerous, Bumpy. If any part of this fails, you're looking at 10 years minimum. Bumpy's smile widened. Then we better make sure no part of it fails. Illinois Gordon was still standing, his fists clenched on the table. This is suicide. You're putting yourself in a cage and hoping that these people, he gestured at the 3 cops, can get you out again. You're betting your life on a system that's already proven it can't be trusted. Bumpy walked around the table until he was standing next to his oldest friend. Illinois. What's the best kind of trap? Illinois looked confused. What are the best kind of trap? Bumpy repeated. What is it? Illinois thought for a moment. The kind your enemy doesn't see coming. Bumpy shook his head. The kind your enemy builds for themselves. The kind where they think they're in control right up until the moment you lock the door from the inside. He put his hand on Illinois' shoulder. They're not putting me in a cage. They're walking into one, and I'm going to make sure they never walk out. The plan was set. Over the next 12 days, each person at that table would play their part. Williams would position surveillance. McCarthy would prepare to track evidence. Cohen would monitor the official channels, and Bumpy would do the hardest thing a man in his position could do. He would wait. He would trust. He would let his enemies think they were winning right up until the moment they realized they'd already lost. But there was one more piece to the puzzle. One more person who needed to be brought into the fold. Someone who had the power to turn all of this evidence into actual justice. Assistant District Attorney Robert Morgenthau, a straight-arrow prosecutor who'd been trying to take down organized crime for years, who'd been stymied by corrupt cops and disappeared evidence and witnesses who suddenly developed amnesia. Bumpy had been studying Morgenthau for months, watching his cases, analyzing his methods, and he'd reached a conclusion. Morgenthau was the one honest prosecutor in the DA's office who had both the skill and the courage to do what needed to be done. On March 10th, Bumpy met Morgenthau in a church in Washington Heights. Both men came alone. Both men knew the risks. Morgenthau looked tired, worn down by years of fighting a system that protected the criminals he was trying to prosecute. "Mr. Johnson," he said wearily, "meeting with known criminals isn't exactly standard procedure for me." Bumpy pulled out a manila envelope. "Nothing about this situation is standard, Mr. Morgenthau." He laid out everything: the frame job, the corrupt cops, the mob connections, the systematic corruption that made it all possible. Morgenthau's eyes widened as he reviewed the documents: financial records, photographs, recorded conversations. It was comprehensive, devastating, exactly the kind of evidence he'd been trying to gather for years. This is incredible," Morgenthau said quietly. "But I have to ask, what's in it for you? Why would you risk everything to help me prosecute the very people who protect your operations?" Bumpy stood to leave, stopped at the door, turned back. "Because corrupt cops are everybody's enemy, Mr. Morgenthau. They protect the criminals who hurt communities. They undermine the honest officers who actually want to help. They make it impossible for people like you to do your job." He paused. "The question isn't why I'm doing this. The question is whether you have the courage to use what I'm giving you." Morgenthau looked at the evidence spread before him, looked at Bumpy, made his decision. "When?" Bumpy smiled. 5 days. March 15th. Early morning. A detective named Ray Sullivan is going to plant drugs on me and arrest me for possession. When he does, you'll have everything you need to prove it was a setup, and to roll up the entire corruption ring that made it possible. The meeting lasted 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes would change everything. Meanwhile, Ray Sullivan was practicing the move for the 47th time, standing in front of his bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning, coat hanging on the door, bag of sugar in his pocket pretending to be heroin. Reach for the pat down, slip the bag into the coat pocket, smooth motion, natural motion. A movement that wouldn't show up on surveillance cameras, that wouldn't look suspicious to backup officers. That would seem like legitimate evidence discovered during a legitimate search. His hands shook. They'd been shaking for days, ever since he'd taken Torino's money, ever since he'd agreed to plant evidence on Bumpy Johnson, ever since he'd crossed a line he never thought he'd cross. The phone rang. Sullivan jumped, nearly dropped the sugar packet. It was 11 at night. Late, but not hospital late, not emergency late. He picked up. "Hello." Helen's voice was weak but determined. "Ray, I couldn't sleep. Wanted to hear your voice." Sullivan's throat tightened. The experimental treatment had started 3 days ago. The 5,000 from Torino had covered the first round. But there were more rounds to come, more treatments, more hope. And all of it depended on him doing something that made him sick to think about. "Hey, baby," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Huh. How are you feeling?" Helen coughed. "Better. The doctors say the treatment is working. They say I might have more time than they thought." More time. The words were like knives. More time bought with dirty money. More time that would cost Bumpy Johnson a decade of his life in prison. More time that Sullivan was stealing from one man to give to another. "That's great, honey," Sullivan said. "That's really great." There was a pause. Then Helen said something that nearly broke him. "Ray, I just want you to know. Whatever you're doing, whatever you're dealing with, I trust you. I know you're doing what's right. You always do." She believed in him, had faith in him, thought he was still the good cop she'd married 16 years ago. And Sullivan couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't explain that he was about to destroy everything they'd built together, couldn't admit that he'd become exactly the kind of cop they used to talk about with disgust. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you so much." They talked for a few more minutes. Helen told him about the other patients in her ward, about the nurses who were kind and the ones who weren't, about how Katie had visited and brought drawings. Normal things. Beautiful things. Things that belonged to a life that Sullivan was in the process of destroying. After he hung up, Sullivan went back to the bathroom, looked at himself in the mirror, saw a stranger staring back, a man with hollow eyes and trembling hands, a man who'd sold his soul for $5,000 and a promise, a man who would plant evidence on an innocent person because his wife was dying and nobody else was offering to help. He practiced the movement again. 48th time, 49th, 50th, each repetition making it more natural, more automatic, more like something he could do without thinking about what it meant. On the other side of town, Bumpy Johnson was sleeping peacefully. 8 hours of deep, restful sleep. No nightmares, no guilt, no second thoughts. Because Bumpy had made his choice weeks ago, had accepted the risks, had prepared for every contingency. And now there was nothing left to do but wait for the trap to spring. March 14th. One day before the frame job, Sullivan couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function. He called in sick to work, spent the day pacing his apartment, checking and rechecking the bag of heroin that Torino had given him. 1 ounce. Pure product. Street value $3,000. Enough to put Bumpy Johnson away for 10 to 15 years. Enough to save Helen's life. Enough to damn Sullivan's soul. At midnight, his phone rang again, but this time it wasn't Helen. It was Torino. "Tomorrow," the smooth voice said. 3:22 in the morning, 145th and Lenox. He'll be walking alone from the Cotton Club to his apartment. You'll have maybe 90 seconds from the time you approach until backup arrives. Plenty of time. Sullivan's mouth was dry. What if something goes wrong? Torino's laugh was cold. Nothing's going to go wrong. Detective, you're going to do your job. Plant the evidence. Make the arrest. And collect your money. Simple. But nothing about this was simple. And as Sullivan hung up the phone, as he looked at the clock ticking toward 3:22 in the morning on March 15th, he had the strangest feeling. A feeling that he was missing something important. That there was a piece of this puzzle he couldn't see. That somehow, impossibly, he was the one walking into a trap instead of setting one. He shook off the feeling. Torino was right. It was simple. Plant the evidence. Make the arrest. Save his wife. That's all there was to it. Except that across town, Bumpy Johnson was making final preparations for a plan that would destroy everything Sullivan thought he knew. A plan that would turn the trap inside out. A plan that would prove once and for all that the smartest move in any game isn't avoiding the enemy's trap. It's walking into it with your eyes open and making sure they're the ones who can't escape. The clock ticked toward 3:22 in the morning, and nobody knew who was hunting who anymore. March 15th, 1959, 3:22 in the morning. Harlem was so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. The streetlights cast long shadows across 145th Street. A stray cat crossed Lenox Avenue, eyes glowing green in the darkness. And in that eerie quiet, Two men moved toward a collision that would change everything. Detective Ray Sullivan stepped out from between two buildings, his service weapon heavy on his hip, hands slick with sweat despite the cold March air. The bag of heroin was in his right jacket pocket. 1 ounce. Pure product. His ticket to $25,000 and his wife's survival. He'd practiced this moment 50 times. But standing here now, all that practice felt meaningless. His hands were shaking worse than they ever had in the bathroom mirror. From the opposite direction, Bumpy Johnson walked slowly down 145th Street, footsteps echoing off the tenement walls. He'd just left the Cotton Club. Normally, Illinois Gordon would have walked with him, but tonight, as planned, as orchestrated down to the smallest detail, he was alone. Bumpy wasn't dressed for confrontation, just a well-tailored coat, a fedora tilted at an angle that spoke of confidence, and that perpetual calm expression that made it impossible to know what he was thinking. The distance between them closed, 50 feet, 40, 30. Sullivan could feel his heart hammering. His mouth was dry as dust. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple, fell onto his hand as he reached into his pocket, and stuck to his fingers as he gripped the plastic bag. Sullivan stepped into the light. "Police! Stop right there." Bumpy stopped walking, turned to face Sullivan with that same calm expression. No surprise, no fear, just a slight tilt of his head. "Good evening, Detective Sullivan," Bumpy said quietly. "Working late tonight." The fact that Bumpy knew his name made Sullivan's blood run cold. "I'm going to need to search you. We've had reports of drug activity in this area." Bumpy's slight smile didn't change. "Of course you have. Go ahead and do what you came to do, Detective." Sullivan approached, went through the motions of a professional search. "Turn around, hands against the wall." Bumpy complied without hesitation. Sullivan's hands moved over Bumpy's coat, moving toward the inside pocket where he would plant the evidence. His fingers trembled as he reached into his own pocket, felt the plastic bag, began the movement he'd practiced 47 times. But as his hand slipped into Bumpy's coat pocket, as he began to release the bag of heroin, Bumpy spoke. Just a whisper. "That bag you're planting, you practiced that move 47 times, didn't you?" "The 31st time. You dropped it." Sullivan froze. His hand was still in Bumpy's pocket, the heroin half released, his entire body locked in pure terror. "How?" He started, but his voice died. Bumpy turned his head slightly. "I didn't follow you, Detective. I didn't need to. I understand you. And that's much more frightening, isn't it?" Sullivan's hand completed the movement automatically. The bag dropped into Bumpy's pocket. The evidence was planted. "You've been watching me," Sullivan whispered. Bumpy's laugh was soft, almost kind. "No, Detective. I've been understanding you. There's a difference. I know about your wife, the experimental treatment, the $47,000 you need, Katie asking if her mother is going to die. I know all of it, and I'm letting you do this anyway." Sullivan felt like the ground was dissolving beneath his feet. "Why? Why are you letting me do this?" Bumpy was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a question that would haunt Sullivan for the rest of his very short life. "Do you want me to run? Detective, I could disappear into Harlem and you'd never find me. But if I do that, who's going to save you?" Before Sullivan could process what Bumpy meant, his radio crackled to life. Sirens cut through the night air. 3 squad cars came screaming around the corner. Officers poured out, hands on weapons. Sergeant Mike O'Brien stepped forward, Sullivan's supervisor, the man who'd helped plan this entire operation. O'Brien's face split into a smile of triumph. What do we have? Sullivan. Sullivan's mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. Found this during a routine search. He finally managed, pulling the bag of heroin from Bumpy's coat pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. O'Brien took the bag, held it up to the streetlight. 1 ounce. High-grade product. He turned to Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson, you're under arrest for criminal possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. What none of them saw was the network of surveillance Bumpy had arranged. A homeless man in a doorway, camera hidden in his coat button, the side mirror of an abandoned car positioned to reflect the entire scene. A third-floor window where one of Bumpy's people recorded with a telephoto lens. Every angle covered, every moment documented, every piece of corruption captured on film. As O'Brien pulled out his handcuffs, Bumpy caught Sullivan's eye one more time. In the confusion of the arrest, Bumpy leaned close to Sullivan, close enough that no one else could hear. Run. Take your family and run. They're going to kill you in 72 hours. Sullivan's face went white. What who? But Bumpy was already being guided into the patrol car. The last thing Sullivan saw was Bumpy's eyes through the window, looking at him with pity, the expression you'd give a man who was already dead but didn't know it yet. The patrol cars pulled away. Sullivan stood on the corner, surrounded by officers congratulating him on a good bust. Feeling like the world had turned inside out. He'd done it, made the arrest, but somehow it felt like he was the one who'd been set up. O'Brien clapped him on the shoulder. Good work, Sullivan. Go home. Get some rest. I'll handle the paperwork. Sullivan walked to his car on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. While Sullivan was having his crisis, Bumpy Johnson was being processed into Manhattan Central Booking, calm and cooperative. They led him to a holding cell. Bumpy sat down, leaned back, and pulled out a book from his coat pocket, The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. He opened to Hamlet and began to read. The guard stared in disbelief. You're reading Shakespeare? Bumpy looked up, smiled. Act 3, Scene 3, about the futility of false prayers. Seemed appropriate. What the guard didn't know was that Bumpy was genuinely relaxed. Every piece of his plan was falling into place, while everyone thought he was trapped. The real trap was just beginning to close. And it wasn't closing on him. Outside the jail, 3 men were working like parts of a precisely engineered machine. Sergeant Marcus Williams downloaded photographs from cameras positioned near the arrest scene. Every angle, every moment. Detective Frank McCarthy watched the evidence flow through the precinct, documenting how O'Brien personally handled it. Spending 3 minutes alone in the evidence room. 3 minutes where anything could have happened. Lieutenant David Cohen monitored paperwork flows, noting how remarkably fast the prosecutor's request came through. Too fast, like someone had prepared it in advance. At 6:15 in the morning, all that documentation arrived on ADA Robert Morgenthau's desk. Photographs showing Sullivan planting evidence. Timeline proving the arrest was prearranged. Financial records showing payments from the Genovese family to police officers. Recorded conversations between cops and mobsters. Organizational charts showing corruption reaching all the way to Deputy Inspector Frank Morrison. Morgenthau sat at his desk, going through the files, hands shaking. Not from fear. From rage. From realizing everything he'd suspected was true. He just gave me a kingdom, Morgenthau whispered to himself. He walked into a cage and gave me a kingdom. He reached for his phone, started making calls. Federal prosecutors, FBI, internal affairs. By the time the sun came up over Manhattan, the dominoes were already starting to fall. Ray Sullivan was having the worst morning of his life. At 7, He drove to the bank where his payment waited. Safety deposit box 247. Inside was exactly what Torino had promised. $25,000 in cash. But there was something else. A folded piece of paper. Sullivan picked it up, unfolded it, felt his blood turn to ice. The handwriting was elegant, controlled. Run. Don't trust them. Don't trust anyone. Not even me. B. J. Sullivan's hand started shaking. Bumpy had left him a note, in a box only Torino should have known about, which meant Bumpy had known everything. He grabbed the money and ran. Called Torino's number. The number you have dialed is not in service. Called O'Brien. Straight to voicemail. Panic rising. Sullivan drove to St. Ouen, Luke's hospital. Burst into Helen's room. Found it empty. Cleared out, like Helen had never been there. Where is she? Sullivan grabbed a passing nurse. Where's my wife? The nurse checked her chart. That patient was transferred this morning, around 6. Private transport, a family request. Sullivan felt the world tilting. He hadn't requested anything. Someone else had moved his wife. Someone who'd left him a note warning him to run. Sullivan drove to his sister's apartment where his boys were staying. Where are the boys? Are they safe? Margaret looked confused. Ray. They're fine. But didn't you arrange for them to go to that private school, the one that called this morning? She showed him a scholarship notification. His sons accepted to a prestigious private school in Connecticut. Full scholarship. I didn't arrange this, Sullivan whispered. The realization hit him. Bumpy Johnson had moved his family, had evacuated them, had hidden them somewhere safe, which meant Bumpy knew Sullivan's family was in danger, that the people who'd hired Sullivan were planning to eliminate him, were planning to kill him within 72 hours, and by moving Sullivan's family. Bumpy had saved the lives of people who'd tried to destroy him. Sullivan sat down hard, started to cry. Loud, gasping sobs, because he finally understood. The trap wasn't made of bars and chains. It was made of his own decisions, his own desperation. And Bumpy Johnson had let him walk into it while somehow managing to save his family anyway. At exactly 7:30 the next morning, March the 16th, FBI Special Agent Thomas Peterson walked into a diner in Queens where Sergeant O'Brien was having breakfast. O'Brien looked up, saw the federal badge, and the toast he was chewing fell out of his mouth. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit civil rights violations, falsification of evidence, corruption of public office, and about 12 other charges. The arrests happened simultaneously across the city. Deputy Inspector Morrison taken from his home. Tony Torino arrested at LaGuardia Airport, 30 seconds from boarding a plane to Miami. 3 detectives, 2 sergeants, a corrupt judge, the entire network, every connection, all of it coming down at once. By noon. Every newspaper had the story. Federal sweep exposes massive police corruption ring. At 2 in the afternoon, A.D. Morgenthau held a press conference. The evidence gathered reveals a pattern of corruption reaching multiple levels of law enforcement. The charges against Mr. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson have been dropped. The evidence was planted by a corrupt officer. This office will not prosecute cases built on false evidence. At 4 in the afternoon, Bumpy Johnson walked out of Manhattan Central, booking a free man. 36 hours in custody. A crowd had gathered. Bumpy didn't make speeches, just nodded to the crowd, smiled, and climbed into a car driven by Illinois Gordon. "Boss," Illinois said as they pulled away, "I still don't understand how you knew it would work." Bumpy looked out at Harlem. "Because there are still honest people in the system. You just have to find them. Give them the tools they need. The trap was never for me. It was for everyone who thought corruption was sustainable." That evening, the Genovese family held an emergency meeting. Vito Genovese himself was there. How did one black gangster in Harlem outsmart our entire organization? Nobody had a good answer. Finally, one capo spoke. He didn't outsmart us, Don Genovese. He understood us. He changed the terms. Genovese nodded slowly. No more operations in Harlem. No more attempts on Bumpy Johnson. We leave him alone. Permanently. Meanwhile, Ray Sullivan sat in his car, staring at his service weapon. His career was over. His reputation destroyed. The gun in his lap felt very heavy. Very final. His phone rang. Unknown number. "Detective Sullivan," a calm voice said. "This is Bumpy Johnson." Sullivan couldn't speak. "I know what you're thinking. I know what that gun represents. But your wife is safe. She's at a private facility in Massachusetts, getting treatment. Your boys are in a good school. Your daughter is with them. They're all protected." Sullivan found his voice. "Why? Why are you helping me? I tried to destroy you." Bumpy was quiet for a moment. "Because you're not a bad man, Sullivan. You're a good man in a terrible situation, and good men deserve a second chance." A pause. "Your family is safe, but you need to run. Tonight, the Genovese family is cleaning house. Everyone involved is a liability. There's a train ticket waiting at Penn Station, track 17. Leaves in 2 hours." "Where does it go?" Sullivan asked. "Somewhere you can start over. Somewhere they won't find you. If you move fast." Sullivan looked at the money. "I can't just run. I have to face what I did. You have to survive." Bumpy interrupted. "You have to live long enough to be the father your kids need. You made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But you made it for the right reasons. That counts for something." The line was quiet. "Your family is safe. I made sure of that, because that's what you were trying to protect. And I respect that." The line went dead. Sullivan sat in his car, gun in his lap, ticket waiting, choice spreading before him, and for the first time in weeks, he had an actual choice. At 8:45 that night, a man matching Sullivan's description boarded a train at Penn Station, track 17, destination unknown. He carried a bag with $25,000 and a burden of guilt no amount of money could erase. And that chapter closed at 11:45 that same night, when mysterious forces moved in the darkness, and the final price of corruption came due in ways nobody could have predicted. Because in the game Bumpy Johnson played, the trap was never where you thought it was. March 18th, 1959, 6:37 in the morning. A sanitation worker found Detective Ray Sullivan floating in the Hudson River. 3 bullets in the back of his head, his badge still pinned to his chest, and in his right hand, clutched so tightly they had to pry his fingers open, was exactly $25,000 in cash. Blood money he'd chosen not to spend. What the newspapers didn't report was what happened the night before. March 17th, 11:15 at night. Sullivan had stood at Penn Station, ticket to freedom in his hand. His family was safe. Bumpy had promised that. All he had to do was get on that train and disappear. But as the conductor called final boarding, Sullivan had torn up the ticket and walked away. He'd made one phone call, to ADA Morgenthau. "Mr. Morgenthau, this is Detective Ray Sullivan. I planted evidence on Bumpy Johnson. The Genovese family paid me $25,000. I'm ready to testify, to tell you everything." Morgenthau tried to convince him to accept protective custody, but Sullivan refused. "I don't deserve protection, sir. I just wanted you to know the truth." Sullivan walked to the Hudson River and waited. They came at 11:45. 2 men in dark coats. No words. Just business. the Genovese family cleaning up their mess. Sullivan didn't fight, didn't run, just closed his eyes and accepted it, because he'd chosen responsibility over survival. The money was still in his hand when they threw him in. A final statement. He hadn't done it for money. He'd done it for love. 3 days later, they buried Ray Sullivan in Queens. Small service, just family. What nobody noticed was the man standing 200 yards away, partially hidden behind a mausoleum. Bumpy Johnson hadn't come to gloat. He'd come to pay respects to a man who'd made terrible choices for understandable reasons. When the service ended, Bumpy walked to the fresh grave and pulled an envelope from his pocket. Inside was $100,000 in a letter. It read, "To the children of Raymond Sullivan. Your father made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he made them because he loved you. Don't become your father, but don't forget he was, at his core, a good man. Use this money for your education, your future, your mother's care. Remember that the measure of a man isn't his worst mistake. It's whether he tries to make it right. Your father tried. That counts for something." Bumpy placed the envelope on the gravestone and walked back to his car. Illinois Gordon was waiting. "You just put $100,000 on the grave of a man who tried to destroy you. Why?" Bumpy was quiet for several blocks. "When you sacrifice your queen to checkmate the king, do you hate the queen?" Illinois thought about it. "No, it's just strategy." "Exactly," Bumpy said. "Sullivan wasn't my enemy. He was a piece in a larger game. I don't celebrate when pieces fall. I just feel sorry for them." Illinois nodded slowly. "The 100,000. That's a lot of money to feel sorry with." Bumpy smiled. "His kids didn't plant evidence on me. They were innocent. They lost their father because of a game he didn't know how to play. The least I can do is make sure they have a future." Over the following months, the Harlem revelation changed everything. 23 officers convicted, new oversight systems created, internal affairs divisions established. The NYPD was forced to confront its corruption, and the Genovese family never touched Harlem again. Vito Genovese himself said at a private dinner, "That man in Harlem isn't a gangster. He's something else entirely, and we don't fight what we don't understand." 6 months after Sullivan's death, Bumpy sat on a bench outside his office. A young boy, maybe 10, was shining shoes for spare change. "You know how to play chess, son?" The boy shook his head. Bumpy pulled out a travel chess set. "Sit down. I'll teach you." After an hour, after the boy won his first game, he looked up. "Mr. Johnson, people say you're the most powerful man in Harlem. Why don't you just kill all the people who try to hurt you? Wouldn't that be easier?" Bumpy looked at the chessboard and smiled. "You know what's easy. Son, killing people. Any fool with a gun can kill. You know what's hard. Changing the system that creates the conflict. Building something that lasts beyond violence. And you know what's hardest of all, changing yourself. Refusing to become the monster everyone expects you to be." The boy thought about that. "So power isn't about being the strongest." Bumpy shook his head. "Real power isn't about making your enemies fear you. It's about making them understand something much more important." He moved a chess piece across the board. "It's about making them understand that they lost the moment they decided to fight you. Not because you're stronger, but because you saw the whole board while they were just looking at the pieces in front of them." He stood up, straightened his coat. "Keep the chess set, son. Practice. And remember, the smartest move isn't always the obvious one. Sometimes it's the one that makes everyone else realize they were playing the wrong game all along." As Bumpy walked away, Illinois fell into step beside him. "You think that kid understood any of that?" Bumpy laughed. "Not yet, but he will. Someday, when he's faced with a choice between revenge and building something better, he'll remember. That's how you change the world. Not by destroying your enemies, but by showing the next generation there's a different way. The story of how Bumpy Johnson turned a frame job into the downfall of an entire corruption network became legend. But the real story was simpler and more profound. It was about understanding that the highest form of power is the power to show mercy. The greatest victory is the one that transforms your enemies. And the ultimate wisdom is knowing you don't win by destroying everyone who opposes you. You win by changing the game itself. Ray Sullivan's children used that $100,000 for college. Helen survived 3 more years, long enough to see her oldest son graduate. And somewhere in Harlem, a boy who learned chess from Bumpy Johnson grew up remembering that real power isn't about fear. It's about understanding. That was Bumpy's true legacy, not the empire he built, not the enemies he defeated, but the wisdom he passed on. The proof that in any game of power, the smartest move is the one nobody sees coming. And the greatest victory is the one where everyone learns something. True power belongs to those who understand it best. And the smartest player isn't the one who wins the fight. It's the one who makes sure their enemies understand they lost before the fight even began.